Judge Donovan Hayes leaves the charity gala, a night that would change everything. The grand ballroom of the Astoria Hotel in downtown Atlanta shimmered under a cascade of golden chandeliers, casting warm light over a sea of elegantly dressed guests. The evening had been a resounding success, a gathering of the city's most influential figures. From lawmakers to civil rights advocates, all gathered in support of legal reform and social justice. At the center of it all stood Judge Donovan Hayes, a towering figure in both stature and reputation. His years on the federal bench had cemented his name as one of the most respected legal minds in the country, a man whose rulings had shaped the course of justice for countless individuals. He had made a career of holding those in power accountable and ensuring that the law served everyone equally, not just the privileged few. Tonight, he had delivered yet another powerful speech, one that resonated deeply with the audience. He spoke of the urgent need for transparency in law enforcement, of the countless cases he had presided over that exposed racial bias in policing. His words carried weight because he didn't just speak from legal precedent, he spoke from experience. The applause had been thunderous, the handshakes firm, the compliments genuine. Yet, despite the evening's triumph, Donovan was eager to leave. The weight of his position as he made his way through the grand hall, shaking the occasional hand, Donovan couldn't shake the feeling that, despite all his accomplishments, despite all the battles he had won in the courtroom, some things had not changed. He had been fighting for justice his entire career, yet still he heard the same stories, saw the same patterns. Black men and women still found themselves disproportionately targeted, still pulled over for looking suspicious, still facing a system that viewed them as guilty before proven innocent. And tonight, as much as he had inspired hope in the room, he knew that justice was never guaranteed. It had to be demanded, fought for, protected. That was the reason he did what he did. That was why he refused to slow down, even at 53 years old. As he reached the valet station, he exchanged a few final words with his colleagues. Jonathan Calloway, the city's police chief and an old friend, clapped him on the back. "Powerful speech as always, Donovan," Calloway said, offering a knowing smile. Donovan nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "Let's just hope the right people were listening," Calloway sighed. "Change is slow, but people like you make sure it keeps moving in the right direction." Donovan appreciated the words, but he had heard them too many times before. Hope wasn't enough. Change required action. The valet approached with his car, a sleek, black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, polished to perfection. A symbol of his success, perhaps, but also a reminder of the assumptions people made when they saw a black man behind the wheel of such a vehicle. He tipped the young valet, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled away from the curb. It was time to go home. The drive home, the city was alive around him, a blur of neon lights, bustling restaurants, and the hum of late-night traffic. Atlanta was a city of contrasts, wealth and poverty, power and struggle, history and progress. Donovan had always loved the city, but he was never blind to its faults. As he drove, the tension of the evening slowly began to unwind. He turned on his radio, letting the familiar voice of a jazz saxophone fill the cabin. The smooth, melodic notes carried memories of his father's old records, of late nights spent reading legal briefs with the sound of John Coltrane playing softly in the background. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax. But peace is a fragile thing, because in his rearview mirror, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. A police cruiser. It had been there for several blocks now, following him. A lifetime of knowing Donovan knew better than to assume the worst, but he also knew better than to ignore his instincts. His pulse remained steady, but his mind was already calculating. Had he made an illegal turn? Was his taillight out? Had he done anything at all to warrant police attention? The answer was no, but experience had taught him that sometimes it didn't matter. He had been here before, not as a judge, not as a respected legal scholar, but as a young man in college pulled over for matching a description, as a newly minted attorney detained outside his own law office because security assumed he didn't belong, as a father lecturing his son on how to act when not if he got pulled over, now as a federal judge driving home after delivering a speech about police accountability. Here he was again. The irony was suffocating. The flashing lights, and then it happened. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night. The siren followed, sharp and commanding. He was being pulled over. Donovan inhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel just a little tighter before signaling and easing his car to the curb. His mind remained calm, but his body remembered too much. Keep your hands visible, don't make sudden movements, be polite, be calm, and most importantly, don't give them a reason. He rolled down his window just as the officer approached. A harsh beam of light hit his face, momentarily blinding him. A woman's voice followed. License and registration. He blinked, adjusting to the light, and got his first good look at her. Officer Catherine Blake. She looked young, maybe mid to late 30s, blonde, her uniform perfectly pressed. Her stance was rigid, her hand resting just a little too close to her holster. She wasn't asking. She was demanding, and in that moment, Donovan understood. She had already decided he was guilty of something. Of what? That part didn't matter. To her, he was just a black man in an expensive car driving through the city at night. And to some officers, that was enough. A decision that would define the night Donovan moved slowly, deliberately. He had lived too long and seen too much to make any mistakes now. "I'm retrieving my registration," he said calmly. "My wallet is in my coat pocket." Blake didn't respond, but her grip on her flashlight tightened. Another warning. "Don't try anything." He handed over his documents, watching as she barely glanced at them before her expression hardened. She looked back at him, tilting her head. Then she smirked, step out of the vehicle, and just like that, Donovan Hayes realized this wasn't about a traffic stop. This was about power. And Officer Catherine Blake had just made the worst mistake of her career. A familiar fear creeps. In the night, air was still. The roads nearly empty as Judge Donovan Hayes navigated the streets of Atlanta, his sleek black sedan gliding smoothly past storefronts illuminated by dim neon lights. The evening had been a long 1 hour spent shaking hands, delivering speeches, and reinforcing his lifelong message of justice, accountability, and integrity in law enforcement. His words had resonated with the audience at the charity gala, a room filled with lawmakers, attorneys, and community leaders nodding in agreement as he emphasized the importance of fairness in the legal system. But even as he spoke of change and progress, Donovan knew the battle was far from over. He had seen too much. He had presided over cases where men just like him, black men, successful, well-dressed, highly educated, were still treated with suspicion, still forced to prove their innocence before being granted the dignity they already deserved. Tonight, he was not just a federal judge, he was another black man on the road at night in a luxury car. And the moment he saw the police cruiser trailing him too closely, he knew what was coming next. The slow realization at first, he didn't react. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, his posture relaxed, maintaining the same speed. He had no reason to be alarmed. He hadn't broken any traffic laws. His registration was up to date, his taillights were functioning perfectly, and he was driving well below the speed limit. And yet, the unease in his gut was undeniable. A single patrol car in a quiet part of the city shouldn't have meant anything, but experience had taught him otherwise. He glanced briefly in the rearview mirror. The officer wasn't just driving behind him, they were shadowing his every move. He changed lanes. The police car followed. He turned onto a different street, hoping to dismiss the possibility that this was intentional. The flashing headlights remained in his mirror, his jaw clenched slightly. This wasn't random. A lifetime of knowing Donovan exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening just a fraction against the leather steering wheel. He had been here before, not in this exact moment, not on this exact road, but in situations just like this one. As a teenager, riding his bike home from a friend's house, stopped by an officer who asked where he was going and why. As a young law student, pulled over for matching a description. As a rising attorney, leaving his firm late at night, only to be questioned about what business he had being in that part of town. And now, as a federal judge, having dedicated his career to upholding the law, here he was again watching history repeat itself. The flashing lights, then the inevitable happened. The red and blue lights flickered on, slicing through the darkness. A moment later, the siren blared. Donovan sighed, a slow, controlled exhale before signaling and pulling over to the side of the road. This was no surprise. He had known from the moment he saw the cruiser in his mirror that it was only a matter of time, and still the weight of it settled heavily in his chest. He reached for the radio and lowered the volume. He needed clarity. His heart wasn't racing, but he could feel the tension tightening in his shoulders, the kind that only years of conditioning could teach a man to suppress. He knew what he had to do. The unspoken rules of survival in moments like these. Keep your hands visible at all times. No sudden movements. Be polite, but don't be too friendly. Remain calm no matter what happens. And above all, don't give them a reason. The waiting game seconds passed like minutes. He could see the officer's silhouette in the side mirror, still sitting in the patrol car, likely running his plates. Donovan wanted to believe that would be the end of it. He was a judge. His record was spotless. A quick check in the system would confirm that. But he had seen enough cases to know that reality wasn't always so simple. Would the officer realize who he was and let him go without incident? Or would this turn into another statistic, another story of a man in power being reduced to nothing more than a suspect? He had no way of knowing. Not yet. The officer's door opened, footsteps against pavement. The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, landing on Donovan's hands. He could see the figure, now a woman, blonde, sharp-featured, her posture rigid as she walked toward his driver's side window. Officer Catherine Blake. Her expression was unreadable, but Donovan could already sense her approach wasn't neutral. This wasn't routine. This wasn't about a broken taillight. This wasn't about a traffic violation. She'd already decided he was guilty of something, and that was enough. A test of composure. Donovan took another breath, then rolled down his window. The flashlight beam hit his face directly, blinding, intentional, a tactic. License and registration, no greeting, no explanation for the stop, a demand. Donovan kept his voice steady. Yes, officer, my registration is in my glove compartment. My wallet is in my coat pocket. I'll reach for them slowly. She didn't acknowledge his words. She didn't reassure him that she wouldn't mistake his movements for something else. But she did tighten her grip on her flashlight, and her other hand, it hovered just a little too close to her holster, another warning. Donovan knew what that meant. She was already considering the worst-case scenario. He moved slowly, deliberately, retrieving his documents and handing them over. She snatched them from his hand. She glanced at them for no more than a second before her lips curled slightly. A smirk. The presumption of guilt. She took a step back. Then her voice, casual, amused, mocking. Step out of the vehicle. Donovan blinked. There was no reason for that order. His documents were valid. He hadn't been informed why he was pulled over. There was no probable cause. And yet, he knew exactly what would happen if he refused. So he did as he had done many times before. He complied. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stepped out of his car and into the cool night air. Blake took a step closer. Her hand was now resting on her gun, and that was when Donovan Hayes knew this wasn't about a traffic stop. This was about power. And tonight, Officer Catherine Blake had just made the biggest mistake of her career. The initial interaction with Officer Catherine Blake, the night air, was thick with tension as Judge Donovan Hayes sat motionless in his car, watching the silhouette of Officer Catherine Blake approach in his side mirror. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of authority, the kind of authority that didn't need to be justified, only obeyed. The flashing red and blue lights from her patrol car cast eerie shadows across his dashboard. The familiar, repetitive strobe illuminated the interior of his vehicle in bursts, reflecting off the sleek black finish of his Mercedes. He had been in enough courtrooms, had ruled on enough police misconduct cases to know how these things could play out. This wasn't a traffic stop. This was an evaluation. She was assessing him. And no matter how clean his record was, no matter that he was a federal judge with decades of legal experience, at this moment he was simply a black man in an expensive car, driving through an affluent neighborhood at night. And that, he knew, was enough. A demand, not a request. Before he could say a word, a harsh beam of light flooded the inside of his car, blinding, direct, intentional. A common tactic. Not just to see, but to intimidate. Her voice followed sharp, commanding, void of basic courtesy. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. No indication of why he was being pulled over. Donovan remained still, forcing himself to maintain a measured, neutral expression. He had seen too many cases where the wrong reaction, confusion, frustration, even simple questioning had led to unnecessary escalation. "Yes, officer." His voice was steady, calm. "My registration is in my glove compartment. My wallet is in my coat pocket. I'll reach for them slowly." Blake didn't respond. She didn't even nod in acknowledgement. Instead, her grip on her flashlight tightened, and then Donovan saw it, her other hand, hovering just a little too close to her holster. Calculated caution, his heartbeat remained steady, but he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. She's already considering the worst-case scenario. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He wasn't being aggressive. He was sitting in his car, following her orders. And yet, her body language told him everything he needed to know. She didn't see a judge. She didn't see a law-abiding citizen. She saw a threat. Slowly, deliberately, Donovan reached for his glove compartment, retrieved the registration, and then took out his wallet from his coat pocket. He handed them over carefully, watching her expression. She snatched them from his hand without a word. She studied his driver's license for no more than 2 seconds before her lips curled slightly. A smirk. That was never a good sign, a smirk that said everything. She took a step back from the car and tilted her head slightly, as if she had just discovered something amusing. "Step out of the vehicle." Donovan blinked. There was no reason for that order. His documents were valid. He had committed no traffic violations. She still hadn't told him why she had pulled him over. This was not a standard stop. This was a power move. He knew his rights. She had no probable cause to detain him. But he also knew how these situations could go. He had ruled on too many cases like this before, cases where innocent men had ended up in handcuffs or worse because they challenged an officer's unwarranted authority. He had 2 choices: assert his legal rights and demand an explanation, comply to avoid unnecessary escalation. Both choices could lead to the same outcome, and that was the terrifying part. He exhaled slowly, unbuckling his seatbelt. Then he stepped out, a routine that shouldn't be routine. The cool night air met his skin as he stood next to his car. Blake took a step closer, scanning him from head to toe, her gaze lingering on his tailored suit, polished dress shoes, and Rolex. She wasn't checking for weapons. She was evaluating if he belonged in a car like his. Her voice carried an edge of sarcasm. "Nice ride." Donovan remained silent. there was nothing to say. He had spent his life earning the things he owned. Every success, every victory, every ounce of his wealth had been built through hard work and perseverance. But in this moment, none of that mattered, because she didn't see his accomplishments. She saw a black man in a luxury car, and in her eyes, that meant he had to be questioned. She circled him slowly. "Where'd you get it?" The mockery begins. The insinuation was clear. "This car isn't yours. You couldn't possibly afford this on your own. You don't belong here." He had heard these words before, maybe not always spoken aloud, but they were always there. In the eyes of the store manager who followed him down the aisles of a department store when he was a teenager. In the tone of the bank teller who triple-checked his ID before approving his mortgage application. In the whispers of colleagues when he first stepped into a courtroom as a young defense attorney, asking if he was really a lawyer. Now, as a federal judge, standing under the streetlights with a police officer, staring him down like a criminal. It was happening again. He met her gaze evenly. "Is there a reason I was pulled over?" Blake smirked again. "I don't know. Something about you just seemed off." A dangerous game. Donovan felt his pulse in his ears, not from fear, but from anger. This wasn't about a traffic violation. It wasn't about public safety. This was about power, and the most dangerous part, she was enjoying it. Then, as if realizing she hadn't pushed him far enough, she laughed. "A judge, huh?" She folded her arms. "Sure you are." That was it. The moment she chose not to believe him. Not even for a second did she consider that he might be telling the truth, because in her mind it wasn't possible. A black man in a suit, in a nice car, in an upscale neighborhood claiming to be a federal judge. Ridiculous. And that was her biggest mistake. Because tonight she had pulled over the wrong man, and the next 24 hours would change everything. A routine stop turns hostile. The night should have ended with Judge Donovan Hayes stepping into his home, unwinding after a long evening of speeches and formalities. Instead, he found himself standing on the side of a dimly lit road, hands pressed against the hood of his car, as Officer Catherine Blake loomed behind him. This was no longer a simple traffic stop. It was something far more dangerous. There had been no reason for him to exit his vehicle, yet here he was, being treated as a threat, not as a respected federal judge, not even as an average law-abiding citizen, but as a suspect. He could feel the weight of Blake's gaze on him, scrutinizing every detail: the cut of his tailored suit, the luxury watch on his wrist, the polished black shoes that had walked through countless courtrooms. None of it mattered, because in her eyes he was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. And now he was in her control. The shift in power. Blake circled him slowly, her movements measured, calculated. She wasn't checking for weapons. She wasn't securing the scene. She was asserting dominance. "Hands where I can see them," she ordered, though his hands were already spread wide against the car. Donovan inhaled deeply, keeping his breath steady. "Do not resist. Do not escalate. Stay calm." He had spoken those very words to so many young men who had appeared in his courtroom, victims of racial profiling and police harassment. Now, he was living their reality. "I have complied with all of your instructions, officer." His voice was controlled, professional. Blake ignored his statement. Instead, she took a step closer. "Do you have any weapons on you?" Donovan's jaw tightened. It was a loaded question, one that had led to deadly consequences for so many black men before him. "No." Blake scoffed, as if the answer wasn't enough. "Turn around and face me." He hesitated, not because he planned to disobey, but because he knew the moment he turned to face her, he would see the expression of someone who had already decided his fate. Slowly, he complied. And when he met her eyes, the look on her face confirmed everything. She wasn't looking for a reason to let him go. She was looking for a reason to take this further. A dangerous game. Blake folded her arms, tilting her head slightly as if she were studying him. "What brings you out here tonight?" The question was almost laughable. She had pulled him over, not the other way around. Donovan kept his posture relaxed, though his pulse had quickened. "I attended a charity gala. I was on my way home." Blake arched an eyebrow. "A charity gala?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm. "Wearing a suit like that? Driving a car like this?" She let out a low chuckle. "And you expect me to believe that?" The statement hit him harder than it should have. He had spent his entire life working for everything he had. He had risen from a modest upbringing, fought through the systemic barriers placed before him, earned his law degree, and became one of the most respected judges in the state. But in this moment, none of that mattered, because she didn't believe him. And worse, she didn't even consider that he might be telling the truth. Tension reaches a breaking point. Blake turned her head slightly, glancing back toward her patrol car, as if considering her next move. Then, without warning, she reached for her radio. Donovan's stomach tightened. She's calling for backup. Why? Because she had pulled over an innocent man. Because she needed reinforcement for a situation she created? Or was it simply because she wanted to escalate? She wanted this to be more than it was. She wanted him to react. Donovan saw it clearly now. The challenge in her posture. The way she was baiting him, waiting for a spark that would justify her actions. But he wouldn't give it to her. Control and composure. Donovan remained still. He had seen too many cases where men in his position, well-spoken, calm, cooperative, had still ended up in handcuffs, or worse. He had spent his entire career fighting against injustice. And yet, here he was, being forced to experience it firsthand. Blake tapped her radio, muttering a few words. He couldn't make them out, but he knew what was happening. She was setting the stage. She was crafting a narrative, one where he was the aggressor, one where she was simply following protocol, the oldest trick in the book. And still, he said nothing. He refused to be the villain in her story. A crucial moment then, in the distance, the sound of another engine approaching. A second patrol car. The headlights bounced off the pavement as it pulled up behind Blake's cruiser. For the first time all night, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She turned slightly as the door to the second patrol car opened. Officer Derek Foster stepped out. Donovan recognized him immediately. And judging by the way Foster froze upon seeing him, Foster recognized him too. Blake turned back to Donovan, as if suddenly aware that something had shifted. But she had no time to react before Foster stepped forward, his face betraying his sudden realization of the mistake that had been made. Blake narrowed her eyes, confused by his hesitation. She had no idea what was happening, but Donovan did. And he knew that, in the next few minutes, the entire power dynamic was about to change, because Blake had made the biggest mistake of her career. And there was no undoing what had already been set in motion. Mockery and power abuse. Judge Donovan Hayes stood still beside his car, his hands relaxed at his sides, his breathing controlled. He had faced tense moments in the courtroom before cases that hinged on the finest legal nuances. High-stakes rulings that could change lives, but this was different. This wasn't a legal argument. This wasn't about the law. This was about power, and Officer Catherine Blake knew she had it. The night air felt heavier now, weighed down by the unspoken tension that stretched between them. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off his polished Mercedes, illuminating the absurdity of it all. A federal judge, a man who had spent decades upholding justice, was being treated like a criminal, and Blake was enjoying every second of it. A game of control. Blake circled him slowly, not with caution, but with amusement. She wasn't searching for a threat. She wasn't ensuring safety. She was taking her time, dragging out the moment, making it clear who held the power in this exchange. Her eyes scanned his suit, his watch, his car. She wasn't checking for weapons. She was checking for reasons to doubt him. She smirked. Nice ride. Donovan remained silent. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned whether he belonged in a luxury vehicle. It was a story as old as time. Success didn't shield black men from suspicion. If anything, it made them more suspicious. Blake folded her arms. "Where'd you get it?" There it was, the assumption, the implication that a black man driving a Mercedes must have done something illegal to acquire it. That despite his tailored suit, his composed demeanor, his confident presence, he still needed to explain himself. Donovan met her gaze evenly. "I bought it." Blake's smirk deepened. She didn't believe him, or rather, she didn't want to, because believing him meant acknowledging that a black man could hold power without owing an explanation for it. And that wasn't what she wanted tonight. Challenging his identity, Blake took a step closer. She was testing him, pushing, waiting for a crack. "A judge, huh?" she mused. Her tone was light, mocking, as if he had claimed to be an astronaut or a famous actor. She didn't believe him, didn't even consider it, didn't pause to think that maybe, just maybe, she had made a mistake. And that was the problem, wasn't it? Not just with Blake, but with the system that allowed her to think this way, to assume power where she had none, to disregard reality because she had already decided on her own version of the truth. The law didn't matter here, only her authority did. The weight of the moment, Donovan had spent his life defending the law, believing in its ability to protect the innocent. But tonight, the law wasn't protecting him. He felt the weight of history pressing against him, the echoes of men before him who had stood in this very same position, forced to justify their existence. It was never enough. A valid driver's license? Not enough. A legally registered vehicle? Not enough. A record free of any wrongdoing? Still not enough. Because to Blake, his crime was existing in a way that defied her expectations. A dangerous amusement. Blake tilted her head, still watching him, still waiting for a reaction. She wanted him to get angry, to raise his voice, to protest, because then she could justify what came next. She took another step forward, close enough that he could see the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. She thought she had won. She thought she was untouchable, and that was her mistake. A shift in the air, the distant hum of an approaching car, made Blake pause. Donovan didn't have to turn his head to know what was happening. A second patrol car had arrived. Blake glanced back, frowning slightly as the vehicle pulled up behind hers. The driver's door opened. A uniformed officer stepped out, and the second he saw Donovan Hayes standing by the car, his face went pale. Recognition. Blake didn't notice, not yet. She was still reveling in her authority, still convinced she was in control. But that was about to change, because this wasn't just another traffic stop, and Donovan Hayes wasn't just another black man in a suit. He was the law, and she was about to learn exactly what that meant. A second officer arrives, and everything changes. The steady hum of an approaching engine cut through the thick silence of the night. Judge Donovan Hayes remained still, standing beside his car, his hands relaxed but his posture rigid. He could hear the faint sound of tires rolling over pavement as another patrol vehicle pulled up behind Officer Catherine Blake's cruiser. Blake, still reveling in her perceived dominance, didn't react immediately. She was too busy enjoying the moment, too consumed with asserting control over a man she had already decided was guilty of something, guilty of existing in a way that challenged her expectations. The second patrol car came to a stop, its headlights flooding the scene. A door opened, and Officer Derek Foster stepped out. Recognition hits. Like a thunderbolt, Foster was young but experienced. He had worked in law enforcement long enough to know when something wasn't right. And the moment his eyes landed on Donovan Hayes, his breath caught. He knew that face. He had seen it before in newspapers, on television, in courtrooms where high-profile cases were decided. Judge Hayes. Foster's stomach dropped. What was he doing here? Why was he standing beside his car in the middle of a traffic stop? His heart pounded as he turned to Officer Blake, who was still oblivious to what was happening. She stood with her arms crossed, a smirk playing on her lips, her body language radiating unchecked authority. She had no idea what she had done. The shift in power begins. Foster cleared his throat and stepped forward. Catherine. His voice was measured, neutral, but Donovan caught the hesitation in it. Blake turned her head slightly, her smirk faltering just a fraction. "Got a big one tonight," she said casually, motioning toward Donovan. Foster didn't return her grin. Instead, he reached for his radio, pulling up Donovan's license information on his in-car system. His worst fears were confirmed. Blake had just pulled over a federal judge. And not just any judge, one with significant influence, one whose rulings had shaped policy, one whose legal expertise far exceeded anyone on this street. This wasn't just another stop. This was a catastrophe, a moment of realization. Foster swallowed hard and turned back to Blake. There was no easy way to fix this. She had gone too far. She had mocked him. She had humiliated him. She had made a fool of herself without even realizing it. And now it was too late to undo what had already been done. "Catherine," he said again, firmer this time. Blake's smirk was gone now. She could sense the shift in tone. She looked between Foster and Donovan, confusion flashing across her face. "What?" she asked, her voice losing its edge. Foster exhaled, glancing toward Donovan before lowering his voice. "You need to let him go." Blake frowned. "Excuse me?" Foster's next words sent an undeniable chill through the air. "That's Judge Donovan Hayes." The blood drained from Blake's face. The moment everything changes. Blake turned to Donovan now, really looked at him for the first time. The name was sinking in. She had heard it before. Judge Hayes, the Donovan Hayes, a man who had presided over some of the most pivotal cases in the city. A man with far more power than she had realized. Her fingers twitched at her side. She had mocked him. She had treated him like a suspect. She had assumed he was lying, and now the weight of her mistake pressed down on her like a boulder. Foster didn't say anything else he didn't need to. The damage had already been done, and in the next few moments, Blake's entire career was about to unravel. What happens when a routine traffic stop turns into a shocking abuse of power? Judge Donovan Hayes never expected to be treated like a suspect, but now the truth is out. Like and share if you believe in justice. Subscribe to see part 2, where the power dynamic flips. Comment below, what do you think will happen next? Will Officer Blake face consequences? Your voice matters. Spread the message and demand accountability. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over.